Episode 2. We're back. Thank you so much to everybody who listened to the first episode last week. We're on the second episode this week. Whether you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcast, we're so glad that you're here with us this week. In this week's episode, I'm going to be talking about my baptism and how the Lord spoke to me in the days leading up to my baptism and what he did for me that weekend. It's one of the most incredible experiences and intimate experiences that I've ever had with the Lord. And it's an amazing story. It's an amazing testimony to him and his faithfulness. So sit back, enjoy this week's episode, and I'll see you guys for an important update after the end of this episode. Well, it's crazy because we were just talking about this off camera before we hit record. This amazing story that I'm about to tell you and how God moved in my life during this weekend happened about a year ago. By the time this comes out, I think it'll be around 8 days until all of this stuff happened, because I was baptized on March 16th, and I think this episode will probably end up going up on the 8th of March. But so about a year ago, I knew that I was going to get baptized, and I knew that my date was scheduled and all of that stuff. And so I was asking God to just speak to me. What do you want me to know? What do you want me to do leading up to my baptism? And I felt led to go to this conference that my church was holding for college students. So it was going to be a busy weekend. It felt like I practically lived at our church that weekend, because we had a session Friday night. I was there all day Saturday, and then I was back there on Sunday morning for my baptism. And so throughout the weekend, I heard bits and pieces of what God was trying to tell me through that conference. Whether it was the amazing sermons from the speakers we had there, like Preston Perry, Bryce Crawford was there, Christian Huff was there, or whether it was worship. We had amazing worship there. Our worship leaders are incredible, but everything ultimately built up to Saturday night. So it started on Friday night in session 1 when I was able to raise my hands above my head for the first time in over 2 years during worship. And that might sound small, but if you remember back from last week's episode with my physical disability and, my range of motion limitations, I hadn't been able to do that. And so it was this overwhelming experience to be able to just lift my hands above my head during worship and fully surrender myself to the Lord. And I texted a very good friend of mine after that session and told her that I was able to do that. And she texted me back and said that she had prayed for that to happen that same morning, and it was an immediate reminder that God is moving even when we don't see it, and that you have friends who love you and care about you that are praying for you even if you don't know it. So the next day, Saturday morning, we all went to breakout groups. All the girls went to the main auditorium to go listen to Grace Valentine speak. I didn't see it, but I'm sure it was great. And then all the guys were in our church's high school environment with one of our campus pastors, and we were talking about what does it mean to be a man of God. And the whole time I was sitting there, I just felt like, I know that I'm a child of God, but I felt like I could never be a real man of God because of my past and what I had been through. I wrote in my notes here, shame was still speaking louder than the truth. So after that, we went to our second breakout of the day, which was breaking free from shame and condemnation. And our guest services director was there. Now, she's, in addition to being our guest services director, she's also in charge of all of the baptisms at our church, and she was the first person that I had met on staff there, and she was super helpful. She made the process of getting baptized so incredibly easy and stress-free, and it was amazing. I love her to death, but she was there, and so I knew that it had kind of hit me that I'm getting baptized, in less than 12 hours at this point. Like, it was really starting to sink in. And so, we talked. I kind of opened up about how I was feeling and what was going on in my head. We talked about what's, the next day was going to look like. And after we finished that conversation, she prayed for me. And one of the things that she specifically prayed for was my health. And keep that in mind because that detail will matter later. So after that, I went home and took a shower, got dressed, and started heading back to our church for session 3 to go hear Bryce Crawford speak. And before I left, I just prayed that Bryce would be used as an empty vessel filled with the Holy Spirit, and that God would use him to speak to us that night. And I also prayed that if there was anyone who needed to hear my story, anyone that needed to hear my testimony and be at my baptism, that God would just place them in front of me. So me and all of my friends get there, and we walk into the church, and we go sit down, and in front of us, there's these 2 guys and 2 girls, and we strike up a conversation. We start talking to them, and right before the service starts, I mentioned to them, I said, hey, I'm getting baptized tomorrow at this church. You guys should come tomorrow morning. And they said, oh, which location and which service? Because our church has 2 services and we have 2 locations. And so I told them, hey, it's at the main campus at the 9:15 service. And they told me that they had just decided 10 minutes earlier that as a group, that's the service that they were going to attend. I never learned any of their names. I never got any of their contact information. I have no clue if they were actually even there that morning that I got baptized. But it was a reminder that when God is orchestrating it, it's undeniable and you can't change his plan. So while Bryce was talking, and it was just an amazing message, it felt like he was speaking directly to me. It was incredible. It's one of the most amazing experiences I've ever been a part of. At the end of Bryce's message, he asked us all to just kneel and on the floor and fully submit to God. And I hadn't been able to do that previously. I wasn't able to get on my knees, especially on a hard like that. Just a few hours after our guest services director prayed for my health, I did in fact kneel on that hard floor in no pain for the longest I've ever been able to do something like that in 2 years since my health issues began. And so the final worship song that they played Saturday night was The Blood by Bethel Music. And it was the first worship song that I ever heard when I came to that church 6 months ago. I don't think that's a coincidence. I cried for the first time in a very long time. And it's still probably one of the most powerful and intimate experiences that I've ever had with the Holy Spirit. It felt very symbolic that there was a tornado warning that night. Outside was crazy. It was raining, it was windy, but inside that church was completely still. And I think that's symbolic that, there are storms, but if you stand on Christ as your firm foundation, you won't be shaken. So a guy, I was sitting there just crying, bawling my eyes out. At this point, most people had left. You could hear a pin drop in that audit. And a guy came up to me and asked if he could pray for me. I had never met him before. I didn't know who he was, but he just said he felt like he was supposed to pray for me. And so he prayed for me, and we talked for a minute after, and then he left. As I finished talking to him, I turned around, and Bryce Crawford is just standing right behind me. And so I grabbed his attention and I said, hey man, thank you so much for coming to speak tonight. Thank you for sharing your story and being so vulnerable as he was with us. I shared with him how God used his message to speak to me. Bryce, if you're somehow watching this, dude, you're amazing. One of the most genuine, humble, down-to-earth people that I've ever met. He gave me 3 hugs throughout the entire course of our conversation, and he made that moment feel very personal and intentional. He congratulated me on my baptism the next day, and it was just an incredible experience. So on Sunday morning, I started tearing up again, and during worship, they played a song called Christ Be Magnified by Cody Carnes. And the first time that I ever heard that song, months ago, I had the thought, I want this song to be played at my baptism. Never prayed about it, never talked to God about it again. I completely forgot about it until they played it that morning during worship. And it was such a good reminder that, God is always listening to us and he's always watching us, whether we tell him or we don't. So after worship, I get in the baptism tub, the baptismal, and I'm just sitting there in this tub. The guy that's baptizing me is standing off to my right, and I'm just watching, myself on this big LED screen tell my story so vulnerably for the first time in a while. It was very open, and I talked about it, my story and what I had been through a lot, but not in this way in front of so many people. And it was a bit nerve-wracking, to be honest, because I said things in my baptism video that nobody knew apart from maybe 4 or 5 of my very close friends that were sitting there. And when I started talking about 2 of my friends specifically that really stuck by my side and helped bring me to Christ, I looked over and they were both crying. And then that's when I lost it again, because we had all been through so much together, especially one of them in particular. She kept praying for me, loving me, even when I would hurt her. I was still very sinful when I came to Christ, and I still am. We're all sinners. That's the whole point of the gospel. We're sinners and we need Christ. But in particular, then I was, not as sanctified as I am now, and I said a lot of hurtful and mean things. Man, it was just so cool. It was such a personal moment and a testament to God's faithfulness in our friendship, because she could have given up on me, but she chose not to. She chose to persevere through it and trust in God's plan for our friendship, and it's worked great. She's one of my closest friends to this day still. And so I went backstage with the guy that baptized me, and he put his hand on my shoulder. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was something along the lines of, it takes a real man to have the courage to share your story. And when he said that, I immediately thought back to Stephen's message from the day before about being a man of God. I had believed I could never be a man of God, but God affirmed me that very next day. Being a man of God isn't perfection. It's courage, humility, surrender, and vulnerability. So later that day, I went with a couple friends of mine to go celebrate, and we went to go get ice cream, and we ran into our college pastor there. It wasn't a coincidence that he was there, because I really wanted to talk with him after service, but I just missed him. I'm pretty sure he ended up going to one of our church's second locations for the 11 o'clock service, so he had to get out of there. But I at the time, I didn't know him very well. I didn't know him as well as I know him now. I really only knew him from seeing him preach messages on Sundays, but I wanted to, meet him. And so God placed him right where I was, and we had a meaningful conversation. And, it was just another example of God connecting dots again. And so 6 months ago, I had my first encounter with the Lord backstage at the theater. And if you want to know more about that, you can go watch last week's episode. But, now I'm sitting here ending my baptism day with some of those same people again. It felt right. It felt complete. We took the whole day to celebrate, not me, but what God has done for me. And it's one of the most special, memorable weekends that I've ever had in my life. Well, thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of the Jack DeWolf podcast. I hope that this story and this testimony was helpful to you, and it reminds you that God is so good, and he has a great, amazing plan for you as well. It's not just me. He wants to do the same things for you in your life and make it personal and individual for you. So make sure you tune in to next week's episode, because we have an amazing first guest to come on the show. It's going to be great. We're going to have a great conversation. I think you guys are going to really love what our first guest has to say. So make sure you come back next week to see who it is. Until then, we'll see you next week. Peace.